Just wanted to let everyone know we apologize for a little bit of the audio there. It's the first time we're doing this. If there's any gaps in terms of the presentation, please let Eugenia or I know. We're happy to fill that in. Thankfully, the slide deck was very comprehensive in terms of the language that we use. So everything that we covered on the slides in the audio is also in the written format, but feel free to ask that question.
We're getting some good feedback on our chat little sidebar here. Thanks for all the feedback. Keep it coming. Does anybody have any questions or any experiences, more importantly, perhaps, that you could share with us? That's kind of part of what this get together is about, is trying to not so much commiserate with one another, but share experiences and strategize and how we can take better care of our patients and our communities.
Hi, this is Richard Howard from Chicago. I don't know if you can hear me okay.
Yeah, we hear you loud and clear. Thanks.
Great. So first, I just wanted to say a couple things. One, thank you very much for hosting this on this really an important topic, which I don't think has received enough attention in the radiology community, although it certainly affects us. I mean, it's been a big deal in the ED world, and I think it's fantastic that radiology is really taking this so seriously, because it absolutely affects us. So I just wanted to thank you for hosting this. The only thing I wanted to add was the group that you mentioned, Physicians for Fair Coverage, actually is a few years old. It wasn't founded this year. And it's got a fantastic website called endtheinsurancegap.org, endtheinsurancegap.org, which has terrific resources on there, including things for like state by state. So if you're looking for ways to get engaged or learn more about it, it's got resources on there, you know, for a lot of different states, including ideas for model legislation, things on fair health. And it's where I've actually taught myself a lot of the stuff, going on there and kind of reading the materials, which I found incredibly useful as well. So thank you very much for this informative session.
Thank you for those comments and for that resource, Rich. We appreciate you joining us tonight. And thanks to Dr. Chorney, who actually added that link to us in our chat. We'll also include some of these links to some other resources offline at the conclusion of the presentation, where we can also continue the discussion later, of course, on ACR Engage. So stay tuned for that. Any other personal experiences or resources or questions or comments? I think one of the key things that Chris and Eugenia both highlighted were in regards to patient education. Nobody likes to receive an unanticipated letter or much less a medical bill in the mail, especially from a physician they never heard of or weren't necessarily sure was involved in their care. But it can be hard enough to have our patients fully understand what's covered, what's not covered, what does in-network mean. And network listings of providers can change so rapidly and so quickly. So it's hard to ensure on everybody's accounts, ours included, you know, whether or not patients really know who's in network, who's not in network. It's interesting, in Australia, they have private payers as well. And they do have some legislation, if I'm not mistaken, and Chris and Eugenia can speak to this perhaps as well, where if there's an elective or kind of planned hospitalization, perhaps related to a hip replacement or something like that, then those hospitals have to notify the patient in due time, you know, whether or not their facilities or their physicians on staff would be out of network. So that's kind of an interesting thought. That's something that we would like to head towards, perhaps. But it would be interesting to reach out to some of those radiologists and some of those physicians and see what their experiences might lend us.
Like Chris, I can tell you at our practice, we actually do have price transparency. Folks can call in and get an sort of off-the-shelf price of what our services are. And if folks are in a position where they do have a high deductible and they realize that puts them in a difficult financial position, it's not that uncommon for them to contact us, usually beforehand, but sometimes afterwards, to see if they can work out a negotiated lower bill, which we almost always honor, particularly if we get a jump on it before the exam is performed. So we do have opportunities, but that's a one-off basis, and it's very difficult to change public perception on a one-off basis like that. So we're going to have to find a bigger way to pass that message on.
Thanks, Dave. Go ahead.
The only thing that I wanted to add is price transparency is a pretty important initiative from Secretary Azar as well. He talked about in a lot of his public addresses about his experience going to the hospital and the inability to really understand how much a procedure costs, and he found that to be very frustrating. I think he's a pretty strong free market guy. In some ways, I think he was simplifying the issue, but this is something that's coming from the top, and I don't think it was a coincidence that all three payment regs for this calendar year rulemaking cycle included something as it relates to surprise bills. The one other thing I wanted to ask, I received a call from a radiologist down in Florida right before we filed our inpatient comments, and he was it was in response to an AIA article that we wrote about our comments, and he was about to read me the riot act because I think he thought that we were commenting that surprise bills were a problem in Medicare. And when I sent him our comments, he immediately called me back. He said, "That's exactly what I would have written." And what I want to know is to just try and see if everybody agrees that they disagree with the administration and that Medicare doesn't really have issues of surprise bills. That would be awesome for us on the GR side, just to hear the perspective from practicing radiologists. And feel free to use the chat function too if it's easier that way.
Thanks, Chris. Yes, feel free to chat in or speak up. You can unmute and ask your question if you'd like. It's interesting. It's always a dangerous thing to do. If you Google surprise medical billing and balance billing, in the lay press, Wall Street Journal, Forbes, there are so many articles about this. And the New York Times had a series called Paying Till It Hurts. I don't know if any of our participants are familiar with that, but that's a really interesting series of reads. It's actually written by a physician author that kind of gives a lot of the patient side of things, which is certainly important, but also our side of things as well. Do we, if an insurance company says, you're out of network, we're going to reimburse you at a lower rate. Well, do we issue the balance of the bill? These are all things we have to think about. We do have a question that has been chatted into us. Do out-of-network issues occur with Medicare Advantage?
That is a great question. We actually have heard that there is potentially some issues of out-of-network billing in Medicare Advantage. We felt that was outside of the scope of the regulations that were put forward, which is why we didn't comment on it. As many of you know, if you basically throw in some things within the regulation that is not specific to the regulation in question, CMS won't respond to it. Specifically, the payment rules that we were dealing with do not touch on Medicare Advantage. The reason for that, I believe, is because Medicare Advantage is a bit of a private insurance way to provide Medicare benefits. So there is that potential if you go out of network within your Medicare Advantage plan. So that's a very good question. And it's a good point to raise.
Do any of our participants or our moderators, for that matter, have any specific comments on the Fair Health databases or alternative dispute resolution as far as ways to mitigate the impact to our patients and to us?
I can tell you from New Jersey, having been through this recently, the insurers hate the whole concept of fair health because the prices are higher. As a matter of fact, I'm on the board of trustees for a local insurance company, and they are working their way out of the fair health range altogether and trying to find another benchmark, because fair health, to us, it's fair. To them, it's excessive. So there's a real gap there that is tough to cross to the insurers, but also tough to sort of justify with a solid public face.
This is Eugenia. I will tell you, in regards to alternative dispute resolution, our Texas chapter, they are very much happy with the law they have in place, where the patient initiates a mediation process upon receipt of a surprise bill. And what we are hearing is something upwards of 90% of issues are resolved within that first phone call. So the patient initiates mediation, and the insurer and the provider then get on the phone call to sort out the billing details. But there's no benchmarking. In New York, we are told that when balance billing occurs, the arbitrator, which is a baseball style arbitration, so it's you're in or you're out, this provider submits their best offer and the insurer submits their best offer, and then the arbitrator pulls up literally 80th percentile of Fair Health database, and the arbitration is awarded to one or the other party. Now, I know in Colorado there's no benchmarking at all, and I know they're Oregon right now, they're working on an all claims database for Oregon. So all of the plans in Oregon will be dumping data into an all claims database that they can then tap to benchmark. But as of right now, as far as robust sort of databases that have a lot of current input of data. Fair Health is sort of the best we have to work with, and in the sense that it's not insurer affiliated at all, so a true third party. And Dr. Yeomans is absolutely correct. The insurers hate it, even though we do know the insurers use it, because I do have a document from United. I'll have to double check my files if I have one from Aetna, but literally within their plan documents, they talk about out-of-network providers receive 80th percentile of Fair Health. So on some level, they must respect it if they use it.
Sounds like some promising first experiences from Texas and from other places as well. Thank you for sharing that with us.
I have a question, which, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
It may have been covered early on. Sorry, I was late to sign in, but how widespread is this in terms of percent of overall claims that are having these issues? Any idea how many, or what percentage? Is it like a few bad actors that are causing a bigger problem?
That's a great question and a tough question. Eugenia and I will try and tackle that as best we can. If you listen to the press, it's almost like it's happening every other day. The website Vox, which was created by Ezra Klein, he used to be with the Washington Post, he has a reporter that's actually focusing on all different types of crazy billings aspects as it relates to healthcare, and he will constantly have examples of this. There was one recently about a teacher who had to go in for an unplanned surgery through an emergency and got whacked with a huge bill. I'm sure a bunch of you saw that. I think a lot of it has to depend on the state that you're in, the market that you're in, and who the primary insurance carrier is, because so much of that determines whether you're in network or out of network. I don't really have any hard data that I can give to you off the top of my head, but I do think that there was, it looks like somebody's saying that there was a proportion of hospital in the recent Kaiser stuff. But I think it's an issue. It's just who's, I think, at fault, and why is this issue becoming more prevalent? That's really where the crux of the battle is.
Thank you for that question and that commentary.
Yeah, I don't know, Eugenia, if you have anything else to add here. I'll try and click on this while we're looking up. Oh, here we go.
I'm trying to look through my files, but I remember in Florida, I think the ER and anesthesia docs had funded a study where there was something like a public poll about 30% of patients get hit with surprise bills, but then they find that it's in something like 4%, not 40, that get hit with out-of-network, like true out-of-network bills. So it's kind of to the point that Chris mentioned. So on 2nd of January, I have a baby. I am a $5,000 deductible patient, and I get that bill for the hospital stay. Am I surprised? Yes, I am. But is it a true balance billing situation? Probably not. Versus something like a second surgeon or NICU bill, or something following a biopsy, or a bill from pathology, or a situation where there's absolutely no ER doctors within the participating plan. So I think it's really difficult to get that data, because oftentimes what happens is they do a poll of consumers, and consumers often answer incorrectly.
Yeah, I mean, the Kaiser article was saying, about 1 in 5 inpatient admissions include a claim from an out-of-network provider. It seems a little high to me, and I think it depends on the definition. I will add one other thing, too. The ER situation is really challenging for them. And there are, like I mentioned in the presentation, there are legit circumstances where patients are hit with surprise bills because they have no idea where they're going. They're completely incapacitated or unconscious. But there's also the fact that ER physicians have to accept anybody that walks through the door, and they have limited ability to kind of negotiate with the insurer as a result of that. And so they don't have a lot of incentive to be in network. And I think sometimes that's what hurts them. So it's a tricky situation.
Well, I'll add one thing, and you may find this a little bit puzzling. So New Jersey was very unique in its law structure, and the rules in New Jersey were that patients could not be balance billed. It was illegal. The insurers were responsible for that gap, period. So patients, by definition, were not getting balance billed. So there were no surprise bills from that perspective. But as the deductibles and copays increased, patients started to feel that difference because they started to have to pay up to the ceiling of their copay or their deductible. And even in that circumstance, the health insurers were really able to move the public into thinking that, in fact, we were balance billing. Not we as radiologists, but we as physicians were balance billing when we weren't. We never had been. It was illegal to balance bill, and the insurance companies had to pay that gap. So the optics here are really, really difficult to fight against.
If I could just re-ask or put out on the floor again, what is everyone's thought about the patient's role in this situation? Because that's really the most difficult thing for us to wrap our heads around. I think Eugenia and I have pushed pretty hard within the college to try and keep the patient held harmless as much as possible, because I think that will make us a little bit immune to some of the attacks from not only the press, but public policymakers. But there is a sizable percentage, particularly in, I'd say, more conservative-leaning states where they have, I think, a more sympathetic legislature, to maybe put some additional responsibility on the patient. So I'd be curious to hear where this group on the phone and on the webinar really fall on that.
I would be more along the lines of protecting the patient. I think, us as patients, we're much more informed and have the resources to go and find out more information. But we have to think about our other patients that do not have that ability and are not as savvy or do not have the resources to do so.
And I think it's fair to divide into more than one category. So, for example, if you have patients coming in for elective procedures, if there really is transparency in pricing, I think it's fair to ask the patient to take responsibility for shopping intelligently. It's a very complex system and difficult to figure out. It takes administrators years of education and sometimes degrees in order to begin to wrap their head around what's going on. So it's not really fair to expect a patient to understand all that. Yeah, but great. For the folks who move into medical care on an emergent basis, as you were referring to earlier, Chris, they're at their most vulnerable point. They are often not in a position to have to make any decisions for themselves. So I think that's really where we could probably find a way to yield and have some sort of negotiated compromise, because the patient really is vulnerable there.
And this is, you will see at the state level, there are types of proposals. So in bill drafting process, they will right away say, we are talking about non-emergency situations. And, in terms of transparency, the pricing information for top 100 procedures has to be made available through the hospital or something like that. So there is certainly an understanding that there's true emergency situations. So oftentimes you will see an attempt to carve out the emergency situations out of it. Like in California, when I say 125% of Medicare benchmarking, balance billing for emergency situations was already banned in California. It was already in statute. So it was only for non-emergency services that we're talking about.
So if I might jump in, this is Mike Lee. Taking a look at the Kaiser Family Foundation analysis, it looks like the one case where surprise billing or balance billing occurs especially frequently is during psychiatric admissions. And obviously, a lot of these psychiatric admissions happen through the emergency room. And not only are these patients requiring an acute requiring inpatient hospitalization, it may be because of psychiatric issue where the patient may not even be able to be aware or really understand the medical care that they're about to receive. So I think it kind of goes back to our initial point, is that while the patients may bear some responsibility in certain situations, really the problem is that there are these extremely narrow networks, especially particularly when in the case of delivering psychiatric care, The narrow networks are really the culprit, and that's sort of the root of the issue. And I feel like that kind of specific case of an acute psychiatric admission sort of illustrates that point.
Yeah, if there's any sort of bias in terms of the type of care that you're getting, and I think there is a pretty strong bias as it relates to the psychiatric care from the private payer side. They're, I think, less willing to cover it. Medicare is even the same way. You're probably going to be more likely to hit with something. So I think that's a great point.
Any other comments?
Guys? We'd love to hear some more. This is helpful for Eugenia and I, especially.
Sorry, going back to that initial question about whether we thought that surprise billing was a problem in Medicare Advantage versus Medicare versus private plans. Could someone just briefly explain to us what the general premise is on why it's not a premise in Medicare, and is it because of the transparency or because of like pre-existing agreements with hospitals and providers? Or?
Sure. So it's a little bit complex, but the way we've argued this is due to the categories within Medicare participating providers. There are the, and I'm just drawing a little blank here, you have the participating providers, non-participating providers, and then the opt-outs. And the somewhat confusing thing is when they describe non-participating providers. You're still technically in the program, but you only get to bill 95% of the Medicare cost of the fee schedule procedure. You can go up to 115%, but the protections in terms of coinsurance for Medicare patients still apply regardless if you are deemed participating or non-participating. The only true folks that are out of network are the opt-out guys who don't accept any sort of fee schedule, and they don't, obviously there's no protection from the patient either, except for when we would argue there is a bit of there's no knowledge gap for that patient because they have to sign an agreement making sure that they understand they're being dealt with by an opt-out physician. The other thing, too, is there's only 1% of all Medicare providers that fall into that category of true opt-out physicians. And within that 1%, only 0.1% fall into the categories of radiology or nuclear medicine. So we've made the argument that this is kind of a red herring. It's primarily a private insurance issue and therefore should be regulated on the state level. Some of our private consultants have really mentioned this, too, that they're just kind of grasping at straws here. I had the chance to look a little bit at the AMA's draft physician fee schedule comment letter where one of the RFIs was included in there. And they didn't take the same tact in terms of there's no problem in Medicare, but they were largely saying this is something that the payer should have to deal with. And if they're talking about payers, then they're not talking about Medicare at all. So I think in some ways it's the excuse for Secretary Azar to try and get after this issue of surprise bills and greater price transparency because he's really mad that it doesn't exist in the Medicare system in general or healthcare in general.
Thanks, Chris. Say, I'd like to interject. It's about 2 minutes from 9 o'clock, and I'm really excited about the way this has started. I'm going to turn it over to Chris McAdams to get some feedback and have him talk a little bit about how we hope to debrief on how successful folks think this has been and how we can improve it. But I want to first just let people know that we're going to have a tweet chat at RSNA, the subjects to be determined. So as we debrief about this offline on a separate platform, I would ask you also to think about what kind of topics you might like to have us discuss at the tweet chat from RSNA in November. Chris, can I pass it to you?
Thank you very much. I want to thank Eugenia, Chris, and Melody Velastros for making this happen, and for Dave Yeomans being an excellent co-host as always. I want to thank all of our participants as well. We'd like to continue the discussion. It's been great tonight. We'd like to continue the discussion offline through ACR Engage and the open forum. We'll make a post. And some of the resources that several of you submitted to us, we can kind of collate there and share that. Let's continue the discussion. If there's any feedback that anyone has, ways we could do this better, possible solutions to any of these problems that we've talked about, or ideas for future topics, that would be a great place to let us know as well. Of course, you can always directly email any of us if you don't want to, type publicly or anything like that, or you can tweet at us. We're kind of everywhere. But I think ACR Engage would be a great opportunity for everyone to continue the discussion. Any other final questions or comments?
Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you all very much. And we look forward to the next one. And thanks again for everybody who participated tonight.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Thank you.
Thanks.